December the 18th, Saturday morning. There is now the greatest need, and only fourpence in hand, which I found in the box at my house. Yet I fully believe the Lord will supply us this day also with all that is required. Pause a few moments, dear reader. Observe two things. We acted for God in delaying the public meetings and the publishing of the report, but God's way leads always into trial, so far as sight and sense are concerned. Nature always will be tried in God's ways. The Lord was saying by this poverty, I will now see whether you truly lean upon me, and whether you truly look to me. Of all the seasons that I had ever passed through since I had been living in this way up to this time, I never knew any period in which my faith was tried so sharply as during the 4 months from December the 12th, 1841, to April the 12th, 1842. But observe further, we might even now have altered our minds with respect to the public meetings and publishing the report, for no one knew our determination at this time concerning the point. Nay, on the contrary, we knew with what delight very many children of God were looking forward to receive further accounts, but the Lord kept us steadfast to the conclusion at which we had arrived under His guidance. He abideth faithful. Under the date January the 25th, 1842, Mr. Müller writes, Perhaps, dear reader, you have said in your heart before you have read thus far, how would it be, suppose the funds for the orphans were reduced to nothing, and those who are engaged in the work had nothing of their own to give, and a meal time were come, and you had no food for the children? Thus indeed it may be, for our hearts are desperately wicked. If ever we should be so left to ourselves, as that either we depend no more upon the living God, or that we regard iniquity in our hearts, then such a state of things, we have reason to believe, would occur. But so long as we shall be enabled to trust in the living God, and so long as, though falling short in every way of what we might be and ought to be, we are at least kept from living in sin, such a state of things cannot occur. Therefore, dear reader, if you yourself walk with God, and if on that account His glory is dear to you, I affectionately and earnestly entreat you to beseech Him to uphold us. For how awful would be the disgrace brought upon His holy name, if we, who have so publicly made our boast in Him, and have spoken well of Him, should be left to disgrace Him, either by unbelief in the hour of trial, or by a life of sin in other respects. Delayed but sure. March the 9th, 1842. At a time of the greatest need, both with regard to the day schools and the orphans, so much so that we could not have gone on any longer without help, I received this day £10 from a brother who lives near Dublin. The money was divided between the day schools and the orphan houses. The following little circumstance is to be noted respecting this donation. As our need was so great, and my soul was, through grace, truly waiting upon the Lord, I looked out for supplies in the course of this morning. The post, however, was out, and no supplies had come. This did not in the least discourage me. I said to myself, the Lord can send means without the post, or even now, though the post is out, by this very delivery of letters He may have sent means, though the money is not yet in my hands. It was not long after I had thus spoken to myself when, according to my hope in God, we were helped. For the brother who sent us the £10 had this time directed his letter to the boys' orphan house, whence it was sent to me. Like as a father. March the 17th. From the 12th to the 16th had come in £4 5s and 11½, for the orphans. This morning our poverty, which now has lasted more or less for several months, had become exceedingly great. I left my house a few minutes after 7 to go to the orphan houses, to see whether there was money enough to take in the milk, which is brought about 8 o'clock. On my way, it was specially my request that the Lord would be pleased to pity us, even as a father pitieth his children, and that he would not lay more upon us than he would enable us to bear. I especially entreated him that he would now be pleased to refresh our hearts by sending us help. I likewise reminded him of the consequences that would result, both in reference to believers and unbelievers, if we should have to give up the work because of want of means, and that he therefore would not permit of its coming to naught. I moreover again confessed before the Lord that I deserved not that he should continue to use me in this work any longer. While I was thus in prayer, about 2 minutes' walk from the orphan houses, I met a brother who was going at this early hour to his business. After having exchanged a few words with him, I went on, but he presently ran after me and gave me £1 for the orphans. Thus the Lord speedily answered my prayer. Truly it is worth being poor and greatly tried in faith, for the sake of having day by day such precious proofs of the loving interest which our kind Father takes in everything that concerns us. And how should our Father do otherwise? He that has given us the greatest possible proof of His love which He could have done, in giving us His own Son, surely He will with Him also freely give us all things. Trust in the Lord better than man's promises. May the 6th, 1845. About 6 weeks ago, intimation was kindly given by a brother that he expected a certain considerable sum of money, and that, if he obtained it, a certain portion of it should be given to the Lord, so that £100 of it should be used for the work in my hands, and the other part for Brother Craik's and my own personal expenses. However, day after day passed away, and the money did not come. I did not trust in this money, yet, as during all this time, with scarcely any exception, we were more or less needy, I thought again and again about this brother's promise, though I did not, by the grace of God, trust in the brother who had made it, but in the Lord. Thus week after week passed by, and the money did not come. Now this morning it came to my mind that such promises ought to be valued, in a certain sense, as nothing. That is, that the mind ought never for a moment to be directed to them, but to the living God, and to the living God only. I saw that such promises ought not to be of the value of 1 farthing, so far as it regards thinking about them for help. I therefore asked the Lord, when, as usual, I was praying with my beloved wife about the work in my hands, that He would be pleased to take this whole matter about that promise completely out of my mind, and to help me not to value it in the least, yea, to treat it as if not worth 1 farthing, but to keep my eye directed only to Himself. I was enabled to do so. We had not yet finished praying when I received the following letter, dated May the 5th, 1845. Beloved Brother, are your bankers still Messrs. Stuckey and Co. of Bristol, and are their bankers still Messrs. Robarts and Co. of London? Please do instruct me on this, and if the case should be so, please to regard this as a letter of advice, that £70 are paid to Messrs. Robarts and Co. for Messrs. Stuckey and Co. for you. This sum apply as your Lord may give you wisdom. I shall not send to Robarts and Co. until I hear from you. Ever affectionately yours. Thus the Lord rewarded at once this determination to endeavour not to look in the least to that promise from a brother, but only to Himself. But this was not all. About 2 o'clock this afternoon I received from the brother who had more than 40 days ago made that promise, £166 and 18 shillings, as he this day received the money, on the strength of which he had made that promise. Of this sum, £100 are to be used for the work in my hands, and the remainder for Brother Craik's and my own personal expenses. Under date 1842, Mr. Müller writes, I desire that all the children of God who may read these details may thereby be led to increased and more simple confidence in God, for everything which they may need, under any circumstances, and that these many answers to prayer may encourage them to pray, particularly as it regards the conversion of their friends and relatives, their own progress in grace and knowledge, the state of the saints whom they may know personally, the state of the Church of God at large, and the success of the preaching of the gospel. Especially I affectionately warn them against being led away by the device of Satan to think that these things are peculiar to me, and cannot be enjoyed by all the children of God. For though, as has been stated before, every believer is not called upon to establish orphan houses, charity schools, etc., and trust in the Lord for means, yet all believers are called upon, in the simple confidence of faith, to cast all their burdens upon Him, to trust in Him for everything, and not only to make everything a subject of prayer, but to expect answers to their petitions which they have asked according to His will, and in the name of the Lord Jesus. Think not, dear reader, that I have the gift of faith, that is, that gift of which we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, and which is mentioned along with the gifts of healing, the working of miracles, prophecy, and that on that account I am able to trust in the Lord. It is true that the faith which I am enabled to exercise is altogether God's own gift. It is true that He alone supports it, and that He alone can increase it. It is true that moment by moment I depend upon Him for it, and that if I were only one moment left to myself, my faith would utterly fail. But it is not true that my faith is that gift of faith which is spoken of in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 9, for the following reasons. 1. The faith which I am enabled to exercise with reference to the orphan houses and my own temporal necessities is not that faith of which it is said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, evidently in allusion to the faith spoken of in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity or love, I am nothing. But it is the selfsame faith which is found in every believer, and the growth of which I am most sensible of to myself, for little by little it has been increasing for the last 69 years. 2. This faith which is exercised respecting the orphan houses and my own temporal necessities shows itself in the same measure, for instance, concerning the following points. I have never been permitted to doubt during the last 69 years that my sins are forgiven, that I am a child of God, that I am beloved of God, and that I shall be finally saved, because I am enabled by the grace of God to exercise faith upon the Word of God and believe what God says in those passages which settle these matters. 1 John chapter 5 verse 1, Galatians chapter 3 verse 26, Acts chapter 10 verse 43, Romans chapter 10 verses 9 and 10, John chapter 3 verse 16, etc. Further, when sometimes all has been dark, exceedingly dark, with reference to my service among the saints, judging from natural appearances, yea, when I should have been overwhelmed indeed in grief and despair, had I looked at things after the outward appearance, at such times I have sought to encourage myself in God by laying hold in faith on His mighty power, His unchangeable love, and His infinite wisdom, and I have said to myself, God is able and willing to deliver me, if it be good for me. For it is written, He that spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? Romans chapter 8 verse 32. This it was which, being believed by me through grace, kept my soul in peace. Further, when, in connection with the orphan houses, day schools, etc., trials have come upon me, which were far heavier than the want of means, when lying reports were spread that the orphans had not enough to eat, or that they were cruelly treated in other respects, and the like, or when other trials, still greater, but which I cannot mention, have befallen me in connection with this work, and that at a time when I was nearly 1,000 miles absent